I'm going to go ahead and move us right along to our next presenter, someone you've already known, of course. He addressed us on Thursday, Professor Rafael Gomez, the chair of our assembly and the director of the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at U of T. Professor Gomez, of course, is going to speak to us about worker voice and civic participation beyond the workplace. Welcome back, Professor Gomez.
Thank you so much. And after hearing those two fabulous presentations, it's going to be hard to match them. And also being the third in line, I know the strain of a whole day takes its toll. So I'm going to be very short to the point and then allow for questions. And forgive me, I'm sitting outdoors, so there's a bit of background noise, but if everyone can hear me, I'll keep plowing along. But Richard, you tell me if the sound is not great.
You're good. You're good.
Wonderful. So my story is quite simple, and I'll begin just with the data. And if Richard can move us one, yeah. So my story is the following. If you look at Canada, and it was alluded to by Professor Koken and also by others since we've been speaking on since Thursday now, it feels like we've been together a lot longer, which I think is a nice quality. That trade unionism, certainly in the US, has plummeted. Less than 1 in 10 workers is a member of a union in the United States. In Canada, it's not so dramatic overall, but if you actually just hone in on private sector union membership, and this is a decade old, but the story is actually worse for private sector unions. The numbers have come down even a little bit more. Those bar charts tell the whole story, don't they? In 1960, 1 in 3 workers was a member. Larger still were the number of workers who were covered by unions. That is, people who weren't formally members, but who had a collective agreement. That was closer to 4 in 10 workers. So 1 in 3 workers in 1960 in the private sector. That would be, workers in manufacturing, workers in private retail jobs, whatever the private sector would offer in terms of work back in 1960, a third of workers were covered. Today, that number is under 15%. This bar chart shows it right hovering at 15%, but in a decade since these numbers were put together, we've seen a decline even still of a few more percentage points. So we're nearing the numbers we have in the US in terms of union members. It's almost 1 in 10 in the private sector. So just going to let you sit on that information. That's a 50-year window, right, or 60-year window. If you go to the next chart, Richard. So this is a chart, goes back even further, just to give you a sense of a bigger timeline. This is voter participation. That is how many people of voting age actually came out to vote in a federal election. I have similar data for provincial elections across Canada and municipal. The story is the same, except the levels are always lower. This makes, actually, talk about rational and irrational behavior. Our civic governments do the most for us, yet we participate least in those elections. We participate a little bit more at provincial elections, and we participate more at the federal. But in fact, each level of government does less for us as you go up. Like the federal government has less of a tangible impact on our daily lives than certainly civic government and certainly provincial governments. But point being, the trend that you see here in federal elections, which is the highest turnout we have for any kind of level of government, is downward. It jumps around, and it hopped up in 2015 when the Harper government was kicked out after a pretty long period, and that was Trudeau's first mandate. But it's come down again to that trend line over the last few elections. In fact, the last election was abysmally low for federal government. And we know in our province of Ontario, right, this most recent election had the lowest turnout ever. It was at 40%. And the people made comments about it being COVID related and just fatigue. I agree. But there's also this trend that we're tracking. So if you notice, this line has come down of people voting in these very important parts of our democratic society outside of the workplace. You can see where I'm going with this, right? There's two things that are correlated, and now we want to know, is there a causation? And this last chart, maybe Richard, you can show them. I'm going to walk you through the data. It's a little busier. It's a table, so it's not quite the graph that you can eyeball. But if you run your eye both first down the columns, we have the participation rate on various dimensions of civic behavior by the status of the respondent. So this is a survey carried out by Statistics Canada called the General Social Survey. And every 5 to 8 years, it will repeat questions. And this was a particular cycle of the General Social Survey that asked a lot of civic participation questions. And what you see here is the first column is union members. The second column is a non-union member column. And then we have the difference between the two. That's kind of column 1 minus column 2. You can see in that last column the plus sign. And what that means is that for every single measure we have of civic behavior outside the workplace, union members are out performing, if you will, on the civic set of indicators, the non-union member. There's a third category of worker called ex-members, because there's workers that were members and then aren't members anymore. And I've looked at data that has that variable, and where you could, I can imagine you could guess where they line up. They're not quite as low as the union member, and they're very close, but they're also not as low as the non-union member. They're somewhere in between, and oftentimes much closer to union members. So the fact that you have been a union member also gives us this effect that you're more likely to participate in any one of these rows. And I don't know if you could read those rows, but the top 5 are just all of the voting that you might do in a federal, provincial, or municipal election, or vote in all elections. That's an interesting variable. Only 56% of respondents voted in all, but you can see that gap is about 10 percentage points difference there, which is not insignificant, right? It's actually quite large. It's about a 20% relative effect there by being in a union and engaging in these civic behaviors. And then down on this kind of section B are things not in terms of voting, but other civic activities like signing a public petition, attending a public meeting. That's a pretty big gap. You see there, you know, a third of union members attend a public meeting and only 18% of non-union members, giving us this 15 percentage point difference, which is about a 50% difference when you look at like the overall average between the two. So I kind of bottom lined it. If you look at the very last row, if you aggregate all of these measures, there is a significant gap of about 11 percentage points between those that are unionized in either voting or performing one of these various civic activities and being non-unionized. Now, my story doesn't end there, because that's just the data telling us numbers and a factual or a descriptive account of what those data are telling us. The more interesting conceptual aspect is the following, and I can make you think of the most obvious story, which is, yeah, you know, when you're in a union, you get exposed to democratic features of life that you might not in other domains. For example, Professor Koken did talk about some very unique and very democratically run unions, and of course others that are not so democratically run, very bureaucratic. But in each of those extremes, the very democratic bottom-up worker run versus the more top-down run, there are still elections. You know, you still have to vote for who represents you. There's voting for who is the president. There's voting when it comes time to ratify a contract. And there's voting to elect who your president or your representatives will be. And you yourself, as a member in most unions, are entitled to run for some offices. So that exposure to democratic life is something that is missed in a non-union setting. So the easiest explanation for this is, you know, some of the skills we pick up at work aren't just skills about how to do our job, but sometimes they are skills that relate to the civic and polity outside of the workplace, to use a word from our previous speakers. The other way to think about it too is that maybe the two things are related, but in a different way. That is, the decline in unions, the fact that we're not joining unions, it seems, in as great a numbers as we did 30 or 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and the decline in voter turnout speaks to a deeper problem. That is, or calling it a problem perhaps is presumptuous, but that's up to us to decide, but a deeper issue, which is that people are kind of turning their backs on democracy. Maybe they don't want democracy either in their workplace, or they feel that their vote doesn't matter in the broader public space either. And so they're turning into more private channels of either forming their own groups, focusing more on local issues or the private domain, and the public space is less important to them. So maybe there's a deeper force at work that's bringing about a decline in both union membership and in democratic engagement, right? That could be another reason for the evidence that we saw. There's just one problem with that second story, and that is the third table, the third slide that you're looking at now. It's this persistent difference. These numbers are right from 17 or 18, one of the last years we had the General Social Survey. So these are very recent data that still show up that union members being part of a unionized environment seems to create a higher propensity to engage in democratic activity outside of work. So what this data shows, this last table, is that maybe in terms of those two explanations, it's really not the former explanation, the one where, we're just not interested in democracy at all. It's rather that forces have come into play that have weakened the institution of unions, certainly, especially in the private sector. Fewer people are exposed to unionization as a daily course of life and some of the democratic features of union life. Not that unions are perfect, not that unions are wholly 100% democratic, but they do have these elements that expose workers to what also occurs outside of work in the democratic space. I should add, there's an interesting follow-up to this research, and that was done by colleagues at my old university of the London School of Economics. They got information on workers that had access to participation at work, and it didn't matter if you're unionized or not, just employers that did some active job of actually involving workers in decision-making. And guess what? The results were almost identical to these. In other words, if I substituted the union member column for participatory, work culture, and that could be in a non-union environment, workers in those establishments were actually more prone to vote, more prone to be active in democratic society as well. So that gives me a clue or an indication that the ways in which we spend most of our time as adults in the workplace can spill over. That was the term used before by Richard to describe what I was going to talk about. Yeah, can spill over into the society at large and produce what I do think are positive outcomes of participating in society in a democratic way, engaging in a democratic way. I think that's very valuable for society. And we risk a lot when people feel so alienated that they resort to none of these channels, right? I believe all of the things that are listed here are useful in a democracy. Attending a public meeting, a demonstration or march, so long as it's peaceful, searching for information on a political issue, something as innocuous as that can be very, very powerful. So that's where I'll leave you. Those were the data telling a story, and then I gave you a bit of the perhaps theoretical background on what the data could mean. And now I'd be more than interested to hear what you think.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Gomez. Let me go ahead and invite folks to raise your Zoom hand, drop a question into chat. I think that was a fabulous way to end our day with presentations with a larger picture and connecting worker voice, the subject at hand, with the overall strength of our society, our democracy, and our participation. I see, Abel, your hand is raised. I'm going to start there, and I'll call on other folks as I see hands come up. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Prof. I think looking at the voter apathy, I think I have really experienced that, and I can relate to what's really happening. When I came from originally from Nigeria, and we have that over the years, we believe that our votes doesn't count. It doesn't really make any difference. And along the line, you realize that if they can rig themselves into power, what is the need? Why should I waste my time to go and vote? So those kind of voter apathy sets in, and people started losing interest, and then these corrupt politicians started having a field day. Now, let's come back here to Canada. I believe probably over the years, those in private sector may have a kind of witnessed some kind of experiences, and that may have played out. So they don't really have that zeal or that motivation, because after all, they will vote. The policies won't, at the end of the day, favor them or be in their own interest. So they decided to, but those in the union who already know how to fight, already back home, we call them like mad dogs. Sorry to use that word, but they know how to fight. They will always come out to, challenge things that they think that is in not their best interest. So that's the way I say that kind of reluctancy in that number, the decline. Thank you very much.
Well, that's fascinating. I agree with you that if people lose faith in the institutions, which they're part of, it's like what the presentation we just saw, right? Exit, voice, neglect, and loyalty. We could descend into those more silent modes of behaving and just allow others to do the work, or neglect or exit. As my family exited a country that had exhibited anti-democratic tendencies about 50 years ago, 60 years ago, they made the move from what was a dictatorship to Canada. And many people do that. We would hope that wouldn't happen in Canada, that we can move from exit to voice, move from neglect to voice. But you're right, crucial to have faith and trust in the institutions, because once you lose that, you're right, the apathy sets in, and then it's a bad spiral, because then these leaders can only need to mobilize a very few people to come out to vote, and to sort of perpetuate that, I guess, form of institutional insider favoritism, which is not constructive. I agree.
Thank you so much. I just want to note that we have 3 hands up, so we'll get to them in this order: Dandy, Mohammed, and Kylie. I also want to acknowledge that both Elaine and Matt have put, I think, very insightful comments into the chat for everyone to have a look at. But Dandy, can you please go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. I kind of want to relate, it's more like a comment in this case and an observation relating both to Professor Raphael and also what Abel, how do I pronounce your name? But there are comments, because I do feel like, from my personal experience and some of my friends, we are immigrants, and previously I came from China, and a lot of my friends are Russians, incredibly hardworking, never complain, and at the same time never voting. So they all have obtained Canadian citizenship, but I think, tying up all the conversations together, given everyone's how we grow up, and then there is a level of practice that I sensed in, the lecture and also the conversations here, is that if you don't ever practice, right, in a union environment or in a lot of these environments, you don't know how to actually carry out these sort of actions, right? You don't know you have a voice, you never practice. You may have it, but you never practice it. So I think like the union environments started to sound like, kind of this place for a lot of people to try and test out, how do we practice democracy? And I think that's really interesting, because even coming here, right, for myself, it's kind of starting to see, I want to try and practice.
I just want to get...
That's all.
Okay, thank you so much. Absolutely, you hit the nail on the head. There's a group of researchers that have found that connection, that civic democracy and civic participation actually embodies a set of skills, civic skills. We used to teach this in school. We had civics lessons. And in the workplace, as you said, when we had high degrees of unionization, there was some exposure to that. Now, the 60s was far from the epitome of a democratically run union movement. Okay, that was very much top down, but there were still elections. There were still some ways in which input could come from ordinary workers. I should give a shout out to companies, though, that have done these things on their own volition. There are very good and well-run companies that involve workers and give those tools to their workers, irrespective of a union or not. There's actually a company in Canada that's celebrating its 100th anniversary of these workplace committees that they established over a century ago, and they've kept them going. So definitely, it's right. It's those skills that you build up on a daily basis that you're unconsciously of, and then you're aware and you say, okay, now I understand a vote can make a difference, even if it's a small voice in a bigger pool. And when you realize it, if you coordinate and can gather people with the same opinion to put pressure, say, on a local councillor or a member of parliament, or go out to vote, you can make a difference. This is why some neighborhoods have great parks and amenities and others don't. It's because those people have used their voice and influence. And I think that's one of the key lessons I've come to know and learn about this area of research. Very true. It's those practice and those skills that build up, that allow us to make democracy stronger.
Thank you so much. I want to acknowledge that I think Mohammed has put his question into the chat. We'll have Kylie next. And I think, Stephen, I saw your hand up. So if you want to have the last question, we can get to that. We have about 4 more minutes here. Let me direct everyone to Mohammed's question in the chat. Could it be that the union members participating in more number in elections is just a random behavior, go with the flow, and not inspired by democratic practice in the union?
There is something to that. Unions sometimes just mobilize people, not because they want to, but they vote as blocks, and they're told, unions have very strong political opinions too, and they can sometimes direct members to kind of vote in their interests. So it's kind of a more automatic process. I wouldn't call it random. It's actually very much coordinated. But there is another, but I think there's a stronger view when you look at people who aren't members anymore and wouldn't have that need. They still seem to be more participatory than people who have never joined a union. So once you carve out people who are union members or ex-members or been part of participatory workplaces, those people seem to have a carry-on or a lingering effect. But you're right, there is also this more automatic, I'm this member and I'm told to vote here and I will do so. Yeah.
Thank you. Kylie, please go ahead.
For sure, thank you. And thank you so much, Dr. Gomez, for providing that presentation. I think it was really informative and valuable. Just a quick comment that I'm also seeing the same trends from the previous workplaces that I've been at, specifically for a nonprofit organization, which has over 2,000 employees. As we try to hear out what our workers have to say through an engagement survey, and this is across Canada, we found that we have about 42% in terms of response rate, and we do it every 3 years. So we also did it again in 2019, and it was about 46%. So we're really not getting enough engagement. So I don't know if it's because our workers lost hope in terms of the change that needs to be done in the workplace. And I'm also seeing this when it comes to student unions or students in a university in terms of election turnout, just because, if they are voting, regardless if it's a board of director or even executives, they are the ones that drive change in a university setting to represent students in terms of, what's it called? For example, public transit within the region itself and whatnot. So for this year, for example, for elections, I believe there was about 30 people out of the 10,000 students that voted for a specific faculty. So it's really low in terms of numbers, and we don't know what the gap is or how to find that missing element.
Yeah, that what you're talking about too, the trend, you had, about half of the workers, and now it's even slipping beneath that. Oftentimes, yeah, people participate once and they see no follow-up, like a direct follow-up or any response, even to say, we can't do X and here's why. If there's silence met on the other side and management uses the information and does some things but doesn't do others, then that could lead to the slide. It goes back to our, the first comment about losing faith in the institutions themselves, and that breeds apathy, or in that 4 quadrant, kind of neglect, or just, loyalty, kind of, that's not too bad, but it's also not the best response. With regards to those student elections, yeah, that's a dispiriting number. It's very small. And I can see why, from a standpoint, I think also life itself is more complicated today. There are more challenges in people's time and the distractions that can come. I think in 1960, we had television and that was like a new technology that took our time, but it was on for only a certain amount of time, and there was only one show you like. I think we did have more time in our lives to spend in these ways, right? Engaging in our democratic institutions. I think there's no doubt our time gets squeezed. We spoke earlier about today, right, with the Minister Lisa Raitt, talking about the caregiving burden that many Canadians care for now. There's children, there's parents who are aging. That's a new phenomenon for many in a society like ours. So I think we have to work really hard to put democratic engagement as one of the things you should be doing, along with watching Netflix and all the other things that you should be, you could be doing. And that's a process. I think that's why we're kind of working on this, is that because everyone more or less works or will work or has worked, if we can bring in those democratic exposures in those time periods, it can then lead to benefits like more student union engagement, more student democracy, because those institutions were fought for. Students weren't consulted 40 years ago. It was a generation that took activism and got their voice heard. And now we're kind of resting on their laurels, right? Their actions to put students in the mix when universities make decisions. Well, those things were done 40 years ago, and maybe we need to reinvigorate that need again, right? To make sure we don't lose these institutions, because if people stop participating, they might say, well, what's the point of having student voice anyway?
Thanks so much, Kylie and Professor Gomez. I want to give Stephen the last question. Stephen, if we saw your hand up earlier, you're welcome to ask. And I just want to acknowledge, Sandra, I saw your hand was up. If you do have a question for Professor Gomez, this goes for anyone, please feel free to put it in the chat or send him a direct message. I'm sure he'd be more than happy to answer it. Stephen, let me go ahead and give you the last question, and then we'll move to our break.
Well, the question that I have, it's based on that we're gathered here to recognize positives and negatives of workplace democracy. And the subject that Dr. Gomez is bringing up is sort of like the negatives of why people aren't involved in democracies. And one of the things I noticed with the United Nations, usually annually, they'll name countries that are number 1, number 2, number 3. And I think last year, Finland was numbered like number 3 or 4. I don't really remember. And I think Canada, and it's going a ways back, about 25 years ago, we were rated as number 1. And for what reason, I really don't know why, but in terms of happiness and democracy. So what I'm wondering, because we want to learn things, why don't we look at democratic countries such as Finland and Norway? I think Norway is number 1, or it was named number 1 recently as maybe 5 years ago. And to look at their institutions, their democratic processes, what people like and dislike, what they're involved in. And maybe we could, so I'm asking Dr. Gomez if he thinks it might be an idea to look at other countries as well, so we could put some additional input into the subject matter of what we're talking about, the positives and the negatives, and evaluate things a little bit better, if that's beneficial or not. I don't know. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Dr. Gomez, quick response to that?
Yeah, very quick. A quick answer is yes. No, other countries are great ways of expanding, our box, the classic cliche with thinking inside the box. And I think when you only look inward, and it's funny, over the last 2 years of COVID, I think we've even come more inward. Like, we weren't even aware what was happening in other provinces for the last 2 years. So definitely learning from others is a very important tool. I would think in this process, between now and the time that we finish up in October, we might have obviously an opportunity to share some of that international wisdom. The one cautionary note is, of course, institutions emerge from very deep historical and cultural backgrounds. And I fell into this trap too. Early on in my career, I was doing comparative work, looking across countries, looking at data, and finding these very important signposts and correlations between, say, an institution and a very positive outcome. And I was like, why isn't that institution in country Y? You know, why is it always in country X? And of course, then you have to get your economists and social science hat out and put on your historical and cultural history hat on to understand why those institutions didn't emerge there. There's often a storyline behind it. Like at least in Canada, we kind of have a social democratic party in the name of the NDP, sort of. At least its essence was started by populist movements merging with labor, organized labor, which is the story in other countries. But that kind of party never emerged in the US. And isn't it curious? We share so much common law history, British colony, and yet they never really had that kind of party. Why is that? Well, that's a historical question that gets into deep institutions. Having said all that, for this session, for this project, you're right. I think there's a lot of interesting learning that can happen from other countries. We're not that dissimilar in the end. And I think we should be able to, when we see a good idea, an opportunity, ask why it's not being implemented here. And maybe then we could look at what are the barriers and reducing those barriers to see how they could fit into our culture and our history. But great observations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen and Professor Gomez, for putting forward those really wonderful big questions for us to ponder about the impact between what we're discussing here and our society at large. And there's been a lot of great comments coming through in the chat as well.